everybody have a chair? Everybody got a seat? It's so good to see everybody. We haven't had our meeting for so long because of the COVID and everybody being sick. And it's just good for you to be here, and we're glad we have a nice turnout. We're gonna call to order, and I want to welcome, first of all, John, would you lead us in prayer?
Sure. Dear God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this occasion, and just ask that you bless the proceedings here. We thank you for Miss Joan and the work that she does, and others who also work on behalf of this organization. We thank you for all the many blessings that you send our way, and ask that you guide and direct us in the future. We ask all of these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. I want to welcome everybody, and we have some guests. Hold your hand up if you're a guest, please. And I'll ask you to stand and give your name.
Yeah, my name is Andy McClendon, and this is my wife Betty, and we're from Poplarville here.
So good to have you with us.
And I'm Gail Smith from Poplarville.
Good to have you with us, too. We're so glad
And
you're
I'm
here.
Carol Fitzwilliam, the better half. I'm from Picayune.
Did y'all sign the book for us? I mean, sign the
Yes.
clipboard? Okay, well, we're glad. We do have a flag in here, in the other building, you know, sometimes we did, sometimes we did. If you'll stand, we'll pledge allegiance to the flag.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, Ginger, did you read our minutes?
Yep. Okay. John Grant called the meeting to order.
Talk louder.
Okay, John Grant called the meeting to order and gave the invocation. After reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, Myra Sharp reported $5,190.96 in the club's treasury. Elizabeth Williams and Cheryl Romell provided refreshments. Johnny Hostin, Glenda Penton, and Maddie Fox were welcomed as guests. Members were reminded to pay the dues of $20 or $30 for a couple. Also to sign up for guides at the museum, suggesting programs, setting up exhibits, and providing refreshments for meetings. Ann Bosworth read May minutes, which were approved. Ginger Hostin presented the program A Brief History of Schools in Pearl River County. Mrs. Hostin thanked Glenda Penton for donating a scrapbook of articles written by her father, Harry Soames, who served as Pearl River County Superintendent of Education. The scrapbook photographs of Loyal School, Poplarville Boarding High School, and a map locating 48 schools and consolidation of the schools were displayed as part of the program. The program included excerpts from Mr. Soames' articles. In 1890, there were 42 white schools and 6 black schools, which eventually were consolidated into 3 school districts: Poplarville, Pearl River Central, and Picayune. In 1890, life was much like Little House on the Prairie. Rural schools were built to accommodate the communities. The buildings were 1 or 2 rooms and no running water. A stream nearby provided water, and bathroom facilities were either an outhouse or the woods. Students took their lunch and walked to school. Most schools provided grades 1 through 6 or 8. Usually there was only one teacher. Families had to purchase textbooks, so books were often passed down in the family. To support the teacher, families paid $1 a month per child and often allowed the teacher to live in their home. In order to obtain a high school diploma, students had to attend a boarding school. The original Poplarville Boarding High School was built in 1892 and burned in 1896. It was a 2-story wooden structure located on the corner of Julia and Church Street. After the fire, students were relocated to a boarding school in Hattiesburg, which later became William Carey University. In 1908, Pearl River Agriculture High School was constructed, which later became Pearl River Community College. In 1960, Poplarville High School was built, and the first class to graduate was in 1961. Nope, I tried to shorten it. The report was like 5 or 6, the program was like 5 or 6 pages. Theodore Bilbo, a native of Pearl River County, served as state senator, governor, and United States senator, advanced educational opportunities for Mississippi. He was instrumental in selecting Poplarville as a site for Pearl River Junior College, the first junior college in the state. Governor Bilbo and the state legislature passed compulsory school attendance in 1916, provided free textbooks in 1939. The state legislature passed laws providing teacher retirement and school lunches in 1944. And I had to Google that information. At the conclusion, Glenda Penton stated that consolidation of rural schools was a hot topic. Her father received many threats. Mrs. Holston told many humorous stories about the schools. Because of time constraints, she encouraged members to read Mr. Soane's articles located in the museum, and they are very many funny stories. So I hope you get to read them. I don't think you want me to read them.
Thank you, Ginger. Any additions or corrections to the minutes? If not, they stand approved as read. Myra is our treasurer, and I don't know if y'all know that she's been very ill. She has cancer in her mouth of her tongue, and she's on a feeding tube right now, and going through chemo and radiation. So please put her in your prayers, because she's going through a really rough time.
Did she give you an amount in the treasury?
In our treasurer at the time, we have $5,430.96. And I'm hoping that Myra will be much better. She's going through treatment through February, I think she said February the 6th, which is still a while to go yet. For some old business, I wanted to tell you, we're gonna have to have some new officers. So somebody's gonna have to step up to the plate. We're gonna have to have a new president, a new treasurer, and I don't know if we can keep Ginger on. I hope we can, as our secretary. She's done a beautiful job for us, and she always makes it interesting. And she's certainly experienced in this, because she's been president too of the garden club and been with us for a long time, so we're hoping she'll stay. We have had change too on our board of directors. We have David Smith, who's now on our board of directors, and he's our vice president as well. The museum's been closed, as most of you know, for months because of COVID, and also because of the sickness going around in town, and a lot of our volunteers were sick. And I'm going to pass around a sheet. We need volunteers, and I want you, please, everybody, please volunteer for something. The reason I'm saying that, we passed the sheet around the last meeting we had. Everybody volunteered for refreshments.
Gotta eat.
That's not gonna cut it. So I'm gonna pass this sheet around. Please put your name in one of these categories. We need people to help us get speakers. I've been doing this, for 13 years now. I've run out of speakers. So I do need some help with that. And I know some of the guys were working on getting some people, I know, but I'm gonna pass this sheet around. Please sign somewhere, not necessarily in refreshments. You got a pen? No. There you
Let me catch it last.
go. Okay. He's
Just something-
chicken.
Yeah.
See where where you need it.
Just keep passing it on around. Please do sign under something. We need your help. If you can't help find speakers, you can help at the museum, to set up exhibits. There's usually 2 of us in there, 3 at the most. Sometimes we set up exhibits and we need help cleaning the museum. There's so many things we do. We can't do it all. We've been doing it all by ourselves for years. I'm worn out, age-wise, as far as health too. So please do step up. I know you enjoy coming, enjoy helping us keep it working.
Ask them what the hours are.
I am working on a new exhibit, and I hopefully we'll meet at the museum the next time. I wanna apologize for,
The confusion here, maybe he asked, this is for, you said volunteers, but this thing is for subject, hometown heroes, communities,
Do we know
newspapers, industry.
what action we're doing for that, or?
See, so
this
that-
is where communities, if you wanna volunteer for, finding people in the community to help, or area schools or whatever, this is just for you to sign in some area. If you wanna help with the newspaper articles, help us publicity wise, sign under newspapers. And if not, just turn it over and write on the back what you can do.
Joe, let me see, they've got the wrong paper.
No, this is the paper I gave them, it's my fault. I meant to give them the one that said volunteer.
Okay, I got you.
This is what I meant to give y'all, I'm sorry. I'm a little bit not with it today, y'all will have to look over me, pass that one that way, pass this one this way. This is volunteering at the museum, but I also want you to help
Oh, okay.
keep the museum open. I don't know yet what the chamber's gonna do, their secretary resigned, and we will open the same hours as the chamber before, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 to 2. They're talking about opening the chamber 5 days a week. So that would give us a better time of days to choose. If we didn't wanna open 5, we might not wanna do Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we might wanna do Thursday and Friday, or, something like that, but please volunteer to work in the museum. At least our hours are, and they're thinking about opening the chamber, I think, at 9. So I'm not sure about that, so better not put that down, Ginger, since we don't know yet what they're gonna do.
Well,
Their secretary resigned, and they're in the process of hiring a new secretary. Until that's hired, we don't know what we'll do, because we come through their door to get into the museum. And the reason being, if not, I'd have to be up there every single time to open the door to get in, and I can't. Anyway, we hope to have the museum up and running again, at least by March. And that's something I want you to think about too. If you don't wanna have the museum open during the winter time, we need to discuss that and kind of get your thoughts on that. I know we don't open it usually during the Christmas holiday sometimes because people are traveling, but sometimes that's a good time to open. People have come from out of town, and that's somewhere for you to take your relatives, is to the museum. But think about all of that, okay? Let me see what else we've got here. I told you, if any one of you really can think of any speakers, please let me know. Because we do need speakers for March, April, and May. So keep that in mind, because I've run out of speakers and I've run out of steam. Anyway, does anybody have any questions about any of that? No? Okay, please do volunteer and help us, if it's to help with the exhibits or to work. And what we've done in the past, for those of you who are not familiar, some of them have worked the hours from 10 to 2. We were open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 to 2. And if you wanted to, you could work from 10 to 12. or 12 to 2, but some wanted to work the entire time. And so we need to know, how can you do that? Because that means we need another volunteer. You can only work from 10 to 2 or 10 to 12. We've got to have another volunteer come in from 12 to 2. So there again, we need an extra volunteer. So keep that in mind as you're signing up for the hours that you can work. I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Some of you know Mike Fitzwilliam, and for those who don't, he's born in New Orleans. He spent most of his life there, and he's lived in Jacksonville, Atlanta, and Houston. He's a Vietnam veteran and served with the Army Medical Command in the 4th Infantry Division. He has a bachelor's degree in secondary education from Loyola University, with teaching fields in social studies and business administration. And he's held several accounting and management positions in his career and was employed for over 32 years with Gulf Oil and Chevron before retiring in 2011. His last assignment was 13 years with Chevron's aircraft operations, with his last 9 years at the Picayune Municipal Airport. He's married to the former Carol Archer of New Orleans, which Carol introduced herself, for 50 years. That's a nice credit right there. That's the number one. And they've resided in Poplarville County since 2002. Have 2 sons, is it Shane? Sean and Kevin, and 2 grandsons, Oscar and Cyrus. He served on the boards of the Little League, the Picayune Chamber of Commerce, Picayune Aviation Commission. He's currently the treasurer for the Senior Center in Picayune, Center in Picayune, and president of the Poplarville County Genealogy Club. So those of you who are interested in genealogy, you might want to talk with Mike afterwards. He's probably can answer some questions for you.
Live people talking about dead people.
He's also a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, an Irish cultural and charitable organization in New Orleans. His first publication was, Do You Know How Picayune Got Its Name? This is one of his books right here. We have this in the library. These books are for sale. We have several books for sale in the museum. For those of you who've not visited the museum, we are planning on having our meeting in the museum next month, so you will have a chance to visit the museum. But some of you, I know, haven't had that chance yet. And this topic today is, do you know how these places got their name? So Mike, without further ado.
Can everybody see this? Maybe if we turn the lights out, it might be better. I'm not going to display anything personally. As you said, I have these places got their name. It's kind of a companion book to the original one that was pretty specific to Picayune. And I got kind of fascinated by it because if you notice on the top left thing, it says Carrier, and I'll get into that in a minute. Yeah, I know. See, and I put it in there. And this is just a sampling. I covered pretty much all the towns between New Orleans and Meridian where the rail line ran. So, as Joan said, my background, I can teach accounting and I can teach history, and I tell people they're 2 sides of the same coin. You have to record the present accurately so the future has a past it can rely on. And they both value evidence over stories. I can't believe things onto the books of a company. Actually, they have evidence and documentation. And a friend of mine, I was writing our family history, and I let a friend of mine edit it, and she was making marginal notes everywhere like I hadn't done anything at all, you know. It's like, and she asked me a specific question about, where'd you get this from? Because I didn't have it footnoted. I didn't have any kind of citation to it. And she said, the question is, how do you know that? And you weren't alive when any of that happened. And that's exactly true for this. So the connections that I have in the book are largely implied. I didn't find a single source anywhere, and believe me, I've worked on this for 1.5 years pretty consistently, where it said, on this day, this place, this mill, this town was named for this person for this reason, and because they were such a great person. it's nowhere, but some of these connections are so stark in their narrowness that you're gonna say, yeah, I believe that's the way it happened. So I have a lot of sources. The book has 476 endnotes in it, and they're from all over the United States. The original headquarters for this rail line, it began in Cincinnati, and then they built the third leg of it. There were two separate railroads, and I'll show you that in a minute. And there's a lot of sources that are going on in here. I can't do anything just by what I heard from somebody say in a restaurant. I have things in the presentation that are not in the book, and because I can use the fair use doctrine. There were some things that were copyrighted that I couldn't put in the book, but I can put them in here. So this is the first one. I tell people there's stories and there's evidence. And this is one of the more out there ones that I found out. This is the guy that Derby is named after, right down the road. James Chester Derby. And here's what I found out. The story was somebody had already written about this. They wrote a lengthy piece about how villages and places up the rail line got their names. And they specifically chose him, and they said he was born in England, but he wasn't. And it said he wore a derby hat. I haven't been able to confirm that. Said he owned timberland and a sawmill, which is fairly common. That railroad was built to extract lumber from that route. Except that he didn't. He managed a hotel in Chattanooga, and he left to be the paymaster and the land agent. He was the guy responsible for going up and down the line and getting rights of way from people who had land where the railroad wanted to put their tracks. So it said he spent most of his time in New Orleans. That part is correct. And the NONNE named the depot Derby after him. That part is correct. He left in 1884, and he returned to Chattanooga because the three connections of the line, I'll have a map in here. It was Cincinnati to Chattanooga, Chattanooga to Meridian, and then Meridian to New Orleans. And they were, like I said, three separate rail lines. So it says he always wore a long frock tail coat. I have no way of proving that. He said he cut all of his timber and returned to England, which we already know is false. He actually left in 1888 from Chattanooga to go manage the Ramona Hotel in Cascade, Colorado, which is at the foot of Pikes Peak. I was up there in the Army when I came back from Vietnam. I don't know why the guy left, because it's fantastic up there. But he did. He left in 1890, and he came here to sell real estate. And then he was elected mayor of Poplarville. Derby, and I found lots of articles where he was advertising real estate for sale. And it said he died in England, and he died in Birmingham, Alabama. So when you go into these things right here, you cannot go by, and it's the same thing I tell people about looking at a family tree that somebody put in Ancestry.com. Use it as a clue. It's not a fact until you corroborate it somewhere else. And I went through to make sure that if I put something out here, that I was gonna corroborate it. So why did I write this book? So I'm gonna get back to the interest in, I'll call it the C-Town for now, because I know everybody has a different pronunciation. Right after we moved from Picayune, Carol used to be the retirement development director for the city of Picayune. And she has cousins in New Orleans named Carrier. And she said Carrier, and a woman she was working with said, Miss Carol, it's Carrier. And I came home from work and she's telling me the story and went, they have a symbol for it? What are your cousins gonna do when they come up here? So it's not just the proper name, there's actually an American translation to it. And I had to write a section in the book to be diplomatic about it, and I said, when you say that name, it immediately tells the listener which side of the Pearl River you hail from. So regardless of the pronunciation, it's the same thing. It means career.
Okay.
So nobody's wrong. And I was selling books at the street fair, and I was telling the story, and I said, it doesn't matter how you say it, it's the same thing. It's just one's a French and one's in English. It's okay. And while I was telling them this, it dawned on me, it doesn't matter how you say it, it matters where you say it. So if you come here and you say Carrier, they immediately know you ain't from around here, are you? And if you go to New Orleans and say, and I'm looking for the careers, they take you to the employment office. So it got me interested in all these other towns. And does anybody know who it's named after? Well, you're in luck. This is the guy. He was on the board of directors of the railroad at the time they started surveying, not when they were building it or anything like that. He was a son of Antoine Carrier from Bordeaux, France. My mother's French ancestors are from Bordeaux, France. And this guy was wealthy. I'll tell you a little story about him in a minute. He owned Citizens Bank, and it was right down Gravier Street in New Orleans from a Robinson and Lacey lumber company. And he owned 33,000 acres of land in Hancock County, which Picayune was. Actually, you can actually go online. There's a Bureau of Land Management website, and they will show you where these land holdings were, overlaid on a current day map. And all of his land was kind of south of Picayune, Poplarville. So I don't know why he got this other train stop, but they put a depot there and he got it named. The original name of the depot was Highland. So Highland Community Hospital is not named for no reason. They just didn't pick it out like the owner, whoever was doing it, came from Scotland. They actually had a name for it. And they changed it to Carrier in 1890. But the post office, which was at the same place, was named after James Lacey, who owned 50,000 acres of pine land around here. And I found a newspaper article that said exactly when he bought it. So Robinson and Lacey and Citizens Bank were right down the street from one was at 134 Gravier and the other one was at 160. So they're actually on the same side of the street. So in 2005, a guy from the Picayune Item interviewed a man in Picayune named John Formby. And this guy had lived in New Orleans for a while, and while he was there, this was a lengthy article, and this guy was 97 years old. And he's basically almost as old as the incorporation of Picayune itself, which was 1904. He was there, right, almost from the beginning. And he said he was on jury duty in New Orleans one time because he was living down there. And he mentioned to the judge, I guess they were asking about you, and he said, I'm from Picayune. He said, do you know where Carrier is? And he said, yeah. And he said, it's named for my grandfather. And I went, oh, I'm gonna go find this guy. And sure enough, that was the judge's grandfather. The judge's name was Olivier Carrier. His father was Edouard, and his father was Emile Leon. Why I have this article, I have no idea, because it's not on the internet anymore, and that's where I got it from. So if you're from Mississippi, and someone says Carrier, how do you respond?
Carrier.
Right? So, the major influences, Captain William Hardy was the guy who had the idea to build a railroad, and I'm gonna get into his little bio here shortly. Eliza Jane Nicholson, who owned the Daily Picayune in New Orleans, she grew up in Picayune long before there was a Picayune there. Julius Simmons, who was an Alabama turpentine farmer, and he came here to extract turpentine, because it really wasn't it was really labor and oxen intensive to get these giant pine trees to somewhere at the market. And in fact, one of the markets was, her father owned a shipping company, and they would go down to where, like Logtown and down there, Poitevin and Favre, and they would ship them around to New Orleans, and the railroad completely cut them off. It was like they just inherited a great line. So all these different people had a role to play. So this is Captain William Hardy. He was a Confederate veteran. He was a lawyer and a judge. And this is his wife, Hattie. He conceived the line, and he thought to connect it to Meridian, which was already being connected up into the north. This was a great thing. He also had a financial motive. The railroad used convict labor a lot, and sometimes they would transfer convicts from one line to another one. He created the Gulf and Ship Island Railroad between Hattiesburg and Gulfport, and he's the one that named Gulfport. He got removed from his position, and I have not been able to I found articles that mention this, but I never found a reason why. For some reason, they booted him. Hattiesburg is named for his wife, but she didn't live long enough to see it. So this is the line. These are the three pieces that I have on here, and Poplarville is right in the middle. And I got a nifty, another couple of stories. So he got the idea in the 1870s. Somebody else already had the rights to it, and somehow he got them. The financing came from the Erlanger Syndicate, and I noticed I was able to include it in there. There's a Erlanger Street here, and there's another one in Slidell. Surveying began in the late 1870s. They built the line, they were expecting to finish before the end of 1882. But they ran into problems. There were two distinct sections that were being built, a northern section and a southern section. He owned a patent for making gas out of pine rosin. And until I started doing this research, in the course of this research, I had no idea that turpentine came from pine rosin. I thought it came from a hardware store. So I learned something here. And this was the guy, he had a financial motive for doing this, and all he had to do was go out and get the financing from the Erlangers. And both of the Hardys were from Alabama. In fact, at this point, I'm gonna tell you that I have an appendix in here, and it lists all the people that I'm profiling. Nobody's from around here. Nobody. They all have things named after them, and they're all transplants. So here's Baron Erlanger. In France, he was known as Delanger, and he married John Slidell's daughter. His father and him were wealthy financiers in Paris. And about 2 or 3 months ago, after I published the thing, I came across a newspaper article from way before this time period that said how they had money. His father was working he was a clerk in a bank in Frankfurt, Germany. And somebody owed him money, and Frankfurt had its own lottery. So he went to the guy, and the guy says, "Will you take my lottery ticket?" And he said, "All right." So he took the lottery ticket, and he won. And then he takes the money and goes and buys the bank that he was working for, and suddenly he's rich, and he passes it on to his son. So Marguerite's the daughter of John Slidell. He was the Confederate minister to France. They were on their way to France because the Slidell's role was to try and get French to come in on the side of the Confederacy. And in exchange for the money that they would give him futures in cotton. So they're still there. Marguerite marries Friedrich, and there's a town in Kentucky named for him, a hospital system in Chattanooga named for her, and 2 streets in Slidell and Poplarville named for, I guess, the family for Erlanger. If you got a lot of money, things get named after you. I asked Loyola how much, could I donate, and they would name something after me. He says, like what? I said, what, you got a building that doesn't have a name? He said, yeah, that's $3 million. So he financed several other railroads in the South, and I found several articles that basically relate that she was the inspiration. She said, I want you to use your money to rebuild the Southern railroads that had been torn up in the war. And he did. So here's her daddy. He was also not from around here, but somehow he made it down here. There was a lot of money to be made. He was a senator from Louisiana, minister to France. He sought funding from Erlanger, but Napoleon III refused to recognize him. Napoleon III did not want to get into this war, and one of the reasons was he point blank told Erlanger's he told Erlanger, not Slidell, their currency is worthless and they're losing every battle. No. And so but he never came home. He never returned, and he died about 12 years before the railroad got completed. And I thought, this is kind of odd that they would name it after him, and he hasn't been here in all these years. But the financier is sleeping with his daughter, and I think, for my part, there was a railroad camp down in Slidell, and it was the kind of the headquarters of building that trestle if you go across the twin spans, it's that third bridge all the way, that's the railroad bridge on the side. It's been substantially improved over time. They've developed concrete now, but that bridge over there was being built at the same time the rail line from Meridian was being built. So the guy that built it, the trestle was named James Hawk. If you go in Picayune and you're on Highway 11 and you turn like at the post office, a couple of streets back is Hawk Street. It's named after him. He was a resident engineer. I think that the name Slidell was for the family. I don't know. I found one article where somebody wrote a letter to the St. Tammany farmer, and they said it's named after John Slidell, but that's not really a good source. I think Erlanger just came home one day and said, honey, guess what I did for you today? And it's a family name more than John, but I'm not going to dispute what people say about that. This one is kind of unique to Picayune, and you're not gonna be able to read it up here, but Julius Simmons came from Alabama. He was wanting to tap trees for turpentine, obviously, and he was the first postmaster in 1891. Now, this is 8 years after the flag stop gets, or 7 years after the flag stop. He donated all the land on the east side of Highway 11, and this is a grid that's in the library in Picayune, and it shows all the streets in there. So when you're going down East Canal, it wasn't always East Canal, if you're familiar with it. These streets that are running this way are 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 8th. The original name of it was First Street. All these streets here are named for people that were railroad executives in and around 1901 when he made the donation to the land. None of them ever lived in Picayune. They all lived in New Orleans, and you can go to New Orleans city directories, you can find out where they were living, and now you can go look at Google Earth, and the houses are still there, and these were not poor men, believe me. So Simmons lived in Picayune in New Orleans. He died in New Orleans after being struck by a car. And I found another article that's about 6 months before he died, is somebody named J.W. Simmons in New Orleans hit somebody else with a car. Apparently it was dangerous times back in the 20s. So I kind of already gave you this, I have pop quizzes built in here. East Canal Street used to be First Street. Highway 11 hasn't always been Highway 11 in Picayune. It was called Harvey Avenue, and this is the guy it's named after. He ran the railroad. He's from Canada. The C&O and TP is the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad. So once it got down here, it started heading west. He resigned as president in 1907. The next street, when you come off of Highway 11 behind the post office there, and it runs for a block, is Curran Street, and he took Harvey's place. He did go to England. He ended up in England, and he died there. Daniel Curran was the executor for his estate, and there's still a residual little piece of street down there called North Harvey Avenue, and nobody I've talked to has ever heard of Cyril Harvey. They just know these streets. It's been gone for a long time. I found on the 1950 census that as they were going down the street, sometimes they would call it Harvey and sometimes they would call it Highway 11, but it was the same place, and I went, genealogist nightmare. Daniel Curran, he was born in Ireland. Yay! He had a really fantastic career. He took Harvey's place in 1893. In the summer of 1898, he was firing an employee because he gave him some bad information on a report, and the employee went to his desk and pulled out a pistol and shot him in the arm. The funny thing is, the employee was never apprehended, but I found a newspaper article that said they expected him to come back because they were holding his paycheck. He's not coming back. And I've never been, I know the guy's name, they put his name in the article. I've never been able to find this guy anywhere else. He's not on the census, no place. I don't know, he got away with it. Behind the post office in Picayune, there's two really ornate signs. They went out and got these, has the symbol of Picayune, and they're black and gold, and they're really nice looking. There's a whole bunch of them like that. And on one side of the street it says Curran Street, and on the other side it says Curran Avenue. So he died in 1938 in Truro, and a lot of these symbols that are on here, it says he was running railroads, he came to run a streetcar line, he was a golfer, he was a big executive, apparently very well regarded. And like a lot of other people, I'm not gonna go through, I could be up here for 3 or 4 hours looking at the whole book, but he was in the Boston Club, he was in Rex. And this was when Rex was, not that, like 20 years old. So he was in Rex. A lot of the other ones, not only in Rex, but they were also in Comus, which means that they had some pretty high social standings in New Orleans when they were there. So here's some other people, and these are kind of related to Picayune. If you go down there, just take a trip down there, and you'll see all these street names. He was a resident engineer. He built that trestle across the lake. He got killed in by a car, standing on the corner talking to a lumberman. I think it was the lumberman that was Lacey's partner. And the story in the newspaper was that it was a chauffeur for a doctor, and the doctor was in the car. And they hit this guy, and they pulled him up on the sidewalk, and the article concludes by saying that he, despite the fact that he was given opiates, he died. Opiates? They didn't specify what it was, but I'm pretty sure if you get hit by a car, that's the last thing you want to put in there. Thomas Steele was the freight manager for the whole thing. On East Canal, they spell the street S-T-E-E-L. On every other intersection, they spell it with an E on the end, because it had an E on the end. But because they misspelled it on that plat I showed you, it's been there for 120 years, and nobody's bothered to change it. I went before the city council in Picayune, and I told them about it, and they went, "It is?" So one time, he ran the entire rail system. He was from Huntsville, Alabama, again, not from here, he lived in New Orleans. He died in Waveland, and this is another guy, Rex and Comus. So he knew a lot of other big people. Gray Street cuts across East Canal. He was the chief clerk for Daniel Curran, and I think what that means is what? He wasn't like his secretary. He was like the, what do they call the guy in the White House? The chief of staff. I think he had some stroke. He eventually gets named the joint agent for all 3 lines that they were running, and he worked in New Orleans, and he goes to Meridian, and he gets hit by a car. That's not a good company to work for. This is this article appeared in the Daily Picayune in New Orleans in August of 1883. The passenger train started running northbound on November 19th, 1883. This coming month is the anniversary in the first week of February, I think it's around the 4th or the 5th, is going to be the 140th anniversary of the naming of Picayune that first appeared in the newspaper. But these red ones that I have here are, when the guy put all the stops on there, this reporter was actually on the train. He went to Meridian and he's on the train. He wrote like a whole page or more about all the stops on the line, giving some of their history. He misspelled a few of them, and Highland is on there, as you can see. He spelled Purvis. Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So this one here, you can't see it, but what I'm circled here is the fact that this place had 2 names at the same time, but there was one just south of it that had 2 names at the same time. And this is around where where the Texaco station and the Picayune item are. That's about, they had to stop right there, like Richardson Road comes off of that. And he spelled Picayune with a K. And even still in 1895, it's got a K in it. That didn't change till about 1910. Somebody said, wait a minute, that's not right. All right, these are 2 people, both named George Nicholson. This is George Nicholson, the second husband of Eliza Jane Poitevin. She married a guy named Alva Holbrook, who owned the newspaper, except by the time they got married, he didn't own it anymore. He sold it to a syndicate of New Orleans businessmen because it wasn't doing very well in 1872. And one of those businessmen was my great-great-grandfather. And there was a bunch of other people that were associated with the Hibernia Bank and like that. And he was from England. This is George Benson Nicholson, and he was responsible for building the rail line from Poplarville to New Orleans. He had the southern half of it. According to legend, Nicholson down the road is named for him. I think she got both of them. They were both notable people, and I think when she named it Nicholson, she got a twofer. So 2 guys went home that day and going, I'm bad, I got a town, man. Nicholson's headquarters for building the southern half of the railroad was right here. This was the terminus, or the starting point for the line. They built it from north to south, and he was here. So I put a few random depots along the line just to give people a flavor for it. This is interesting. Samuel Winery built the northern half of the railroad, and he was from Meridian to Poplarville, and he was on the train. As they get to each depot, they start running back and forth. So like when they got to Enterprise, they would go Enterprise to Meridian, and they would go to Pashuta, and they would keep going back. And it kept getting longer and longer because they were still building the trestle across Lake Pontchartrain. So he selected on the train, and he said, I'm gonna name this depot after you. And Winery said, that's nothing but a laurel swamp. And he said, all right, we'll get another place for you. And guess what? It never happened. There's no Winery, Mississippi. It just never happened. So I got another Ladner and Hisdale. It struck me as odd. It was first reported on that list as spelled Ladaneer, and it was clearly wrong. There's a Ladner cemetery up there, there's a whole bunch of Ladners. The Batson brothers, Lorenzo and, I forget his name. I forget his name. Ladner was gonna be on the line, and these guys set up a shop to serve, like a little general store, to serve the guys working on the railroad, and Ladner disappeared in favor of Hillsdale.
Okay.
And there actually is a Ladner in Pearl River County, but it's to the east, and it's not by the rail line. And you can go, I went down there, I actually drove up there, it's a long little drive because the railroad and Highway 59 kind of diverge. And there's a Batson cemetery, and Rosa Batson McGehee was a sister. This is a whole different story. I put it in there because there was a lumber mill in Picayune. When you get to the end of where Goodyear Boulevard and Beach Street are, right on the other side of that was the Rosa Lumber Mill, and it was named for her. I got a lot of information from Mattie Jo Fox. This is her grandfather, Daniel McNeil. Both of these guys were native of North Carolina. They came to Mississippi to be turpentine farmers. I found censuses where they were living maybe a farm or two farms apart from each other. In 1891, William Graham is named as the postmaster for McNeil. And I'm thinking, well, I think he was named it for the family. Daniel McNeil, in a newspaper article, didn't move there till about 10 years after that. And it says he moved, the article said he moved from Lacey, which, as I told you, was the post office down there. So then McNeil becomes the postmaster, and like three different times he's the postmaster in McNeil, and they jointly owned a mercantile company up there. There's a book in the Picayune Library that has photographs of them. Daniel died in 1931. This is an interesting story because Mattie Jo didn't know how he died. And he died in Louisiana, and I know how to get death certificates out of Louisiana, and I went to visit her, and I brought a whole bunch of papers, and I gave it to her, and one of them was a death certificate, and what turned out, the census had him being born in 1 year, his tombstone in McNeil Cemetery has another year, and the death certificate has a third year. So I said, well, when was he born? And she said, well, I would trust the tombstone. I went, I don't know, not a guy doing this. He doesn't, they don't know. He only knows what they told him. So when he dies, his wife takes over being the postmaster. She retires in the 50s, and they give it to their son. And I went, Nepo man. So I give credit to Mattie Jo McNeil Fox for her research. So Lamont, I don't know if y'all know about, some of these people are kind of more local to Picayune, but these two people that I'm gonna talk about, Crosby and Rollins, were big not only in the lumber business, but also in the tongue business. He's from Michigan. His wife, Ellen Goodyear, is from Wisconsin. Ellen is actually a third, when I first got there, I'm thinking Goodyear, it's the blimp, right? Well, it's not. These were lumber people, but they are related to the guy who vulcanized rubber, Charles Spencer of Goodyear. So I actually did their genealogy, and I wanted to put it in here. She's a third cousin twice removed, so she's not in the will. They get to Picayune, they're making their fortune, but they didn't come there necessarily to be in the lumber business. They were at the Christian Science Reading Room at the publishing company up in Boston, Massachusetts, and he was on the board of trustees, and Mary Baker Eddy, who was the founder of the First Church of Christ Scientists, died, and there was something in their bylaws that said you couldn't be a board trustee unless she approved it and the board of trustees approved it, and she was dead, and he fought it in court saying, I don't accept that she's dead so I can be on the board of trustees. And they said, you can't just doubt she's dead. She's dead. So they booted him off, and he ended up in Picayune. So the Goodyear family was in lumber in Wisconsin and Mississippi and California. Her brother was partners with them, and they owned the Pearl River Valley Railroad that went back up into the woods and would bring lumber back out to the main line. They bought the Rosa Lumber Mill from R.J. Williams in 1917, And that turned into be a very lucky thing. He also pioneered the planting of tongue trees in the 1930s, and they were all over the place. And I have a little thing here. He planted this stuff like in the early 30s, and by 1935 and 37, they were all blooming. He had something like 900,000 trees. And it just so happened that in 1937, the Japanese invaded the Yangtze Valley in China because they wanted all of the valley. The tongue trees produce, when they're processed, they produce a waterproofing agent. It's in varnish, it's in paint. And they had been using it for hundreds of years. Well, the Japanese said, we'd like to have it. And just about the time they take over all the Chinese stuff, he blossoms. So it's like I tell a guy I play golf with, never discount luck. When they bought the mill in 1917, it was right after the United States entered World War I, and they needed the lumber to build barracks all around the South. And they immediately made money, and they made a lot of it. They were cutting down trees like you wouldn't believe. So, Poplarville. Anybody know what this is? It's a tulip poplar, right? I used to have 3 of these in my front yard when I was growing up in Jefferson Parish. There are people, I've read some things where they think it's an aberration of the word popular, Jim Smith. Their family history is in a book in the library down in Picayune. And there's a WPA, there's an oral history in there, and it says there were several people that were living around here who were named Jim Smith. So they gave them nicknames. James Pascal Smith is who Poplarville is named after, and it's because they distinguished him. One guy was Bowley Jim Smith, and they gave them all nicknames so they would be able to distinguish them. Poplarville was already in existence before the rail came through. It came here on purpose. It didn't just create a depot out of nothing. They didn't really need a right of way. It was here and it was ready to go. So that's a tulip poplar, and it says that he had a lot of this on his land. And my parents used to cut these things off when I'd go to school, figuring if the apple didn't work, maybe the flowers would. But Robert Joshua Williams, he owned the land and lumber company down in Bay St. Louis, and he sold it to a guy named Walter Jex, who I think is, if any of y'all know Juanita Jex down there, she used to run the Historical Society. I think this guy is somehow like a great uncle of her husband's. Haven't been able to put it together. He owned a half interest in the Rosa lumber mill down in Picayune with Eastman Tate, who had lots of jobs. He was a big banker and mayor. And he got Tate's half and he sold it to Crosby and Rollins. He gave a lot of money away. He donated land for where Picayune High School is right now, and he also donated land on the corner of West Canal, and I think it's either Quince or Rester, where Gibson's Antiques is. That was the original St. Charles Borromeo church there. WRJW is named for this guy. And I was talking to a banker down in Picayune one day, and when I was doing research, and I said I found out who the radio station named that. It's not even on their website. They had no history on there at all, even though they got a section called history. It wasn't much at all. And the banker tells me, well, I knew him. Yeah, it's Robert Joshua Williams. And I went, you're younger than I am. How could you have known him? Guy died in 1930. She said, no, I knew him. And I thought, maybe I've made a big mistake here. So I went back and I started doing the research. As it turns out, he had a son named Granville Williams. Granville was big in real estate. He had 2 sons. One was Granville Jr. and one was Robert Joshua Williams II. At the time the radio station signed on, the second Robert Joshua Williams was a mechanic in a sawmill. That's not who you name a radio station after. And I found lots of other nifty stories about this. And I think in this case, this is another example where they got a twofer. You couldn't go wrong saying WRJW, even though the grandpa was dead, this kid's still alive, and then, it looks like they're honoring everybody. So here's L.O. Crosby. He's from Brookhaven. He's had a lot of stuff. The obituaries that I found for this guy, I mean, he was somebody to know, but like everybody else, he had, some odd things. He came to Picayune with a lot of borrowed money from International Harvester because their headquarters was in Chicago. People were still making wagon tongues and wagons and box cars and stuff like that, and IH wanted to have a big source of supply, and they hooked up with Crosby and Rollins, and that mill down there did it for him. He had about $3.5 million that he got from them, and I put it in an inflation calculator, and it's about 116 million today. Again, they just entered World War I. He has just a substantial biography. I mean, this guy was into everything, and he was in New Orleans a lot. And in fact, I think he died there. There was a perverse property tax law back at that time that said your land is worth more for property tax valuation if the trees are still standing. Out came the saws, and all of a sudden they found out that they didn't have any more lumber. They had to shut 5 mills that they owned. They kept buying mills. So he turned to tung oil processing. He was a big processor, while Rollins had all the land. He had some, but it wasn't that. But he had a dairy company down there. He was doing truck farming. He had little farms that people could work during the Depression. And he died in Touro Hospital, which is where both my sons were born, 1948. So I just threw in some sidelights. I already told you 3 people got hit by cars. Millard committed suicide. This is another interesting story.
He started Touro Hospital?
He died there.
Oh, he died?
He died there,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
It's a view to Churros.
Millard was, I can't remember what his title was, but he was pretty high up in the railroad hierarchy. And he left to go to work at the Cotton Exchange in New Orleans. And he was buying cotton futures when the price was tanking. No, he was selling it short while the price was going up. That's not what you want, not what you want to do. And apparently he went home and ingested some heroin and died. Curran got shot while he was in his office. Surprisingly, ironically, Crosby and Rollins and Goodyear, they're all streets in Picayune. They don't intersect each other, but their lives did. The streets are all in different places. Crosby and Rollins are like parallel to each other. So 2 of the streets down there, Rollins Street doesn't have an S on it. Like I said, I brought this up to the city council, and some of them were interested and some are not. Tongue is a Chinese word for heart, and if you look at the shape of the leaf, now you know. I feel like Paul Harvey. So a couple of more interesting sidelights. The original spelling of the word Picayune is Picayune in French. It was from the Provence region. I think that all in Savoie as well. It was a 16th of a Spanish dollar, 6 1/4 cents. And in the very first issue of the newspaper, which was called The Picayune, it said, "When we exchange our Picayune for yours." And that was it. They named it after the thing you were gonna give them. About 11 months after it opened up, they changed it to the Daily Picayune, and it was that until 1914 when they merged with the Times Democrat. It wasn't gonna be a stop on the line. It was not on that list that you saw. And they got it to be a flag stop. So in November, it was the 140th anniversary of the first passenger train, and I'm convinced, I have not found any documentation for this, but so many people have said it, I almost have to kind of lean on it, is that they stopped there and she named the town and she named Nicholson for her husband. Except for the fact that this other Nicholson built the railroad, and there was, Derby was a railroad guy, Millard's a railroad guy. I think she got a twofer. So Nicholson. Nicholson was her second husband. Her first husband was a guy named Alva Holbrook, and he was 35 years older than her. Her father, John Poitevin, refused to go to the wedding. So they got married after he'd sold the newspaper, and in about 1.5 years or so, they found out that 225 people can't run anything, and they sold it back to him. 3 years later, he dies and she inherits it. She's the first female publisher of a major newspaper in the United States. Albeit inherited, she made it work for 20 years till she died. George Benson Nicholson was the other guy. I think it's really ironic that the guy who's building a railroad and is intrinsic in this has a middle name of Benson, because they were both born in England. Anybody know what Nicholson's name before they changed it? Crescent City. I'm convinced without proof that when she named that town, she said there's only gonna be one Crescent City and it's not you, you're now Nicholson, and 2 people. I told you, hey. All right, a few more. Of all these people I profiled, I told you none of them were from around here. and only once from Hancock County, and that was Eliza Jane. Of the 29 stops that were on that list, only 5 are still served by Amtrak, including Picayune. Purvis is an interesting story. On that original list, it's spelled P-U-R-V-E-S. Somebody put up a Wikipedia website about Purvis, and it says that he spelled his name E-S. He was from Alabama. His family traces back to South Carolina and then I think Scotland. And they said when they put the depot up, they spelled a sign P-U-R-V-I-S. So he went and legally had it changed to P-U-R-V-I-S. It's a lie. And what I did, I for some reason, I made a mistake on this and I neglected it. So I have an addendum in here that has his whole story in there. This is kind of something, if I do a revision sometime in the future, it'll all be included. Anybody know about Richardson down by Picayune? There's a Richardson Road and a Richardson-Ozona Road. This is another interesting story. Richardson family was from Jackson. Edmund Richardson was known as the Cotton King. This guy owned more cotton in the United States than the entire nation of Egypt. John had a big dry goods store. William owned 640 acres, and I found it on this map, this Bureau of Land Management map, and it's right where you can see the railroad cutting right through it. So they named the post office for him. So Mitchell was named after Thaddeus Mitchell, and Richardson had the post office. He also died in 1935. I could not find out this guy was rich. I mean, he should have been in some of these organizations. He had very little to say about him even after he died. So this is the daddy. This is Edmund, and this is the brother John. I couldn't find a picture of him. They didn't have one with the obituary, and I was kind of disappointed because you can't hardly tell a resemblance here, but it looks like he should be on the cough drop box. So this was the beginning, the train, and it's the end. But I have one more slide. Channel 12 in New Orleans put together a documentary on the Irish digging the New Basin Canal in New Orleans back in the 1830s. And I had been in the process of gathering a lot of research to make a book about it, because it's all these stories about thousands of Irish people died, and I know people that say it's just not true. They put this documentary together, and they interviewed me, and I gave them a lot of my documentation, and it's in this. It's on YouTube now. They're probably going to run, if you get Channel 12 on DirecTV, they're probably going to run it, but it's on YouTube now. So if you just go in there, here's the link. If you just go in there and put in the title in YouTube, it's the first and only thing that'll pop up, and you'll see somebody that you know. The end. Anybody have any conflicting stories?